Welcome to my first attempt at class on biblical scholarship and literacy. This will be the first lecture, and we're just going to try it out and see if you guys find this interesting. If you do, we'll keep going, and we'll have another class next month. Feel free to have some coffee, and we'll do while we chat, and we'll just jump in. Where is my mouse, and why isn't it? Okay, so the first thing is what I'm going to do and what I'm going to teach. I have a URL here, and I can send this out in an email if you'd like, but it takes you to this place. And what I'm trying to do, it'll be a little different than what we've done before, but I'm going to try to have a web page that will have some information on when the next class is, that sort of thing. It also has a syllabus. And so it's got my link to my lecture, which we'll record and then you can watch. It's got slides and some even link to my notes, some other YouTube videos that are related. And then the next class has some reading. This is what we'll be talking about in the readings for the class. And so hopefully, the syllabus will be helpful because it'll tell you what we're going to cover next time. Because unlike the other subjects, when we talk about the Bible, you might, maybe not, but you might want to read what we're going to talk about. And if you do, there needs to be some, warning of what's coming. And so I've tried to create a course outline that can help with that. It'll be online at this URL, and I'll try to send that out in an email so you can get to it. It's got some other stuff like about the course and things like that I haven't filled out yet. I'm still working on creating that. Why did it just do that? That's not what I wanted. Hold on, let me get my slides back if I can. Where'd they go? Where the heck did they go? Oh, I see. Right there. Let's go back to present mode. And I think full screen is the bottom of this is cut off, and I can't see what button I'm pushing. There we go. Okay, so if we're going to study the Bible, and we're Unitarian Universalists, so one of the things that happened in Unitarian Universalism is the Bible was our central text for a while. And at some point, the UU congregation got together, and Ann can tell us more about this, and they made the decision that the Bible was going to be among the list of sacred and secular texts that we draw inspiration from instead of being the core text. And that leaves a certain question. Why would a group of us, some of us I assume are atheists, some are agnostics, some are theists, some are Christian, but some aren't. Why would we, as a group, want to study the Bible? So, I think one of the things we might want to think about is that 88% of Americans own a Bible, and 80% of Americans say that the Bible is a sacred text. So, of some sort, some of us might answer that affirmatively as well. But so, what does that mean? And I think it's really difficult to underestimate the impact the Bible as a book has had on American society. 61% of people say they want to read it more. And this, by the way, was collected by a fundamentalist Christian group who believes the Bible is inerrant, etc. But they collected these statistics, and they're publishing them to bemoan, the fact that these numbers are so low. Most of us are shocked they're this high. For example, they define Bible engaged as someone who believes it's infallible and reads it often. Bible free is someone who thinks it's infallible and doesn't read it often. And then Bible neutral is somebody who thinks it's valuable, doesn't read it often, but thinks it might contain errors. So if you believe there are any errors in the Bible for them, you're all the way down in the Bible neutral category. But on their scale, Bible friendly is 38%, 20% Bible engaged, so think it's infallible and read it often. And then the biblical skeptics are the people who think it's just another book, teachings of men. That's only 19% of us, and only 13% would qualify as biblically hostile, meaning it's just a book and it's full of bad stuff. And then you've got these trends over time that are just fascinating to look at, that they've collected. You know, the skeptic is sort of rising, and it's at the cost of biblically engaged, which was dropped. And biblically neutral has stayed about flat, although it seems to be dropping too. We seem to be in an age of polarization where biblically neutral people are going down, and you either think the Bible is this horrible thing, or you think it's this perfect, infallible thing, perfect God's word with no errors. And the middle ground seems to be losing some hold, and I think that's unfortunate from my perspective. The infallible position is an impossibility from my standpoint. But the friendly, neutral positions all seem like reasonable places for good people to land. And the skeptic position is certainly something that rational people can hold. But I think it may, as Anne said in her sermon just a little while ago on Palm Sunday, sometimes we throw the baby out with the bathwater. So what my goal isn't to push a specific opinion on the biblical authority or its truth or whether you should believe in God or Jesus Christ. My goal in this class will be to help you understand a text that is significant and has impacted at least 3 different major world religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, in very fundamental ways. And so it's impossible to understand what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in America today, without understanding the book and the texts and the stories that motivate so many of these people's interactions. So that means I have 2 goals. One is literacy, and the other is scholarship, and they're competing. And when we decided to set up this course, there was some discussion about, do we want a course on literacy? Do we want a course on scholarship? Because to some extent, those goals are antithetical to each other. It's very difficult to do both because they have different depths, we would talk about different things depending on the goal. But we really wanted both. There was a lot of discussion about how we want literacy, we want scholarship, and so we're going to try to do both. The reason you want literacy, as we just described, is to understand the stories that motivate so many of the people in our country and in the world. So you need to be literate to know the stories. Scholarship is important because I think it defends against fundamentalism. Because scholarship tells us who wrote the text, when it was written, what we know about archaeology, which parts of it can be verified by history and archaeology, and there's a lot that we know is accurate, and which parts can't, that have no evidence, so that it's an argument from silence either way, and then which parts are utterly refuted, and there are 1 or 2 of those. The Bible will make claims that are just refuted. So scholarship tells us what the consensus is, and some of that can be wrong. We don't claim infallibility, unlike the text, but unlike some interpreting the text. I mean, the text itself doesn't actually claim infallibility, which is a fun discussion. So we don't claim, as scholars of the text, infallibility, but we can point out that the story of Moses, for example, has almost everything with it. It's Moses' birth. Has almost everything in common with the story of Sargon's birth. Somebody borrowed from somebody to create that story, and Sargon lived first. Unfortunately, to muddy the waters, the story of Sargon was written later. So it's impossible to prove the order of that influence. When we talk about the law code of Moses, however, we have the law code of Hammurabi, which we've talked about in my comparative religion class. The law code of Hammurabi came first, without any doubt, and we have the text of that. And the law code of Moses borrows heavily from it and is influenced by it. So that's the sort of thing that scholarship tells us. It tells us where it came from, who's borrowing from who, when the text was written, and what influences on the text there were. And what it tells us, for example, is that there is no way that you can think of this text, once you know its influences, as something that was just kind of dictated by God, word for word, perfect and infallible, without any possible errors. It was something that was written by people who may or may not have been inspired, who are filled with biases, and cultural background and existing previous laws that they were used to living under that influenced what they wrote, what they thought, and how they thought of God. And so scholarship is that last piece. Tell us what those influences and things are. And I'm going to try to do both. And again, like I said, those two goals are antithetical, and that's going to make this hard. Because at one level, we're going to be at a very surface level telling you what the stories are, because some of us don't know some of these stories. You'd be surprised how many stories there are in the Bible that are very famous that we don't know. But we're also going to try to then dive into some of the scholarship questions and issues. And somehow I have to merge those. And bear with me, because that's not easy. So at that surface level, what the heck is the Bible? What is it? Because that's got to be where you start. There are two parts to the Christian Bible, the Bible as Christians understand it. The first is the Old Testament. The second is what's called the New Testament. And then there's a third part, which we'll talk about briefly, called the Apocrypha, where that comes from and what it is. So first, the New Testament. This is John, and it says, en archon, in the beginning was hologos, the Word, and kai hologos, and the Word was with God, theon, at the end of the first line. So in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God, etc. This is John chapter 1, and it's a statement of Trinitarian belief, almost without any doubt, which is relevant to a discussion on Unitarian Universalists. So this is the New Testament. It was written in Greek. So what was Greek? At the time of Christ, Rome controlled the area of Israel and Palestine, and the Romans spoke Latin, but Greek was the lingua franca, which means the French language almost, but it's the language everyone speaks when they talk internationally to each other, which is used to be French, so they call it the lingua franca, but now it's kind of English. If you go to scientific conferences, everyone speaks English, whether they're native speakers of English or not, which can be hard to try to understand them. And so it's English today, it was French, and further back it was Greek. And the reason it was Greek was because of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great conquered the known world at the time, created the largest empire the world had ever seen, and spread the Greek language everywhere. So even though the Romans spoke Latin, Greek was the language they used to speak to others. And so the New Testament, almost all of it, was written directly in Greek. The other language that a lot of people used was Aramaic, because that was the language that the Babylonians and some of these earlier civilizations had used to speak. And so that was kind of the early lingua franca. So Aramaic and Greek are the languages that they were immersed in. There is some evidence that some of the New Testament was written originally in Aramaic or originally in Hebrew and translated into Greek. But the texts we have are all in Greek, the early ones. And we're pretty sure most of them were written directly in Greek originally. The Old Testament, however, is written in Hebrew almost entirely. There are one book that's written in Aramaic. I really should know how many, but there's at least one book that's written in Aramaic. But most of it is Hebrew. And Aramaic, by the way, uses the same alphabet as Hebrew, but it's a different language with the same alphabet. So if you're kind of thumbing through a Hebrew Bible, you don't notice when you switch to Aramaic. But most of it is written directly in Hebrew, and probably written directly in Hebrew and not translated. It was originally in Hebrew. So here we have Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et ha'eretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, etc. You'll notice some parts of this. We'll talk about we'll talk about the parts that you're seeing in a minute. So like I said, it was originally written in Hebrew. So we have two parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. One was written in Greek, the other was written in Hebrew. And of course, the term itself, Old Testament, is a Christian term, because what it means is these two books testify of Christ, they believe. The Old Testament with its prophecies of Christ is the older testament of Christ, and the New Testament is the New Testament of Christ. But both of these books, they would claim, testify of Christ. Thus, the Mormons subtitled the Book of Mormon, Another Testament of Christ, to add on to this whole concept. Of course, the Jews don't call it the Old Testament. For them, this is just the Hebrew Scriptures. This is the Scriptures. And if you read the New Testament, that's how they refer to it, because the New Testament didn't exist when the New Testament authors were writing. And when they talk about the Scriptures, they mean what we call the Old Testament. So the Old Testament is what I'm going to call, probably from now on, the Hebrew Scriptures. And now that we've introduced the Bible, we're going to start with the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. And so from now on, most of the rest of the class is today at least, is about the Hebrew Scriptures, and then we'll work our way through them and then into the New Testament. Assuming we get that far, that could take 10 years, and who knows. Okay. Dead Sea Scrolls. These are the oldest copy of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures that we have, kind of complete. There are other passages we have, for example, a reference to the blessing, the Lord bless you and keep you, from about 600 BC, written on a metal amulet. So that is a very old text. That's from the time of Jeremiah, before the destruction, and we have references to the priestly blessing from all the way back there. So that some of the Bible is fairly old. We'll talk about dating it in a bit. But kind of the biggest corpus of complete text we have is from the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's why the Dead Sea Scrolls is so interesting to so many scholars. It's the oldest copies we've got of some of these texts. It's got stuff besides the Bible. It's also got stuff like the Book of Enoch in it, and the Manual of Discipline, which is rules for their community. So it's got biblical texts and other stuff. But the biblical texts are the ones we're interested in here. You'll notice something about this text. It has what we call consonants, these squiggles here. And it has none of the dots. These are the dots. You see the difference between this text and this text. What the dots are the vowels. So Hebrew was written with consonants only and no vowels. Turns out Egyptian was written that way, and Babylonian was written that way, and Sumerian was written that way. And they thought of vowels much the way we think of inflection. Their mind thought about it differently because they grew up thinking that way. You know, to try to wrap your head around this difference, think of the Chinese who use in Mandarin inflections up, and those are different words if you scoop up or scoop down. We use those things to ask questions. Is this word sentence a question? See, we use inflection to mark questions and things, but we don't use it to mark different words. They use those inflections to mark different words. In Hebrew, the vowels are almost inflections, but they do change the word, but they don't change the root of the word. This is why Hebrew has roots. What they change is the tense of the word, past tense, present tense, or things like that. So for the most part, the tense can be inferred from the text, and you don't need the vowels. If you see the consonants, you know how to vowel it with very little ambiguity. Once in a while, though, there's a passage that's ambiguous, and because you don't know the vowels. So a group called the Masoretes in the Middle Ages decided it would be really nice if we could codify all this stuff. And there were also multiple copies of the Hebrew Bible floating around, and each had different variants. You know, somebody had missed, because these things were written by hand, and whenever you copy something by hand, you make errors. And so what they did is they collected all these texts, compared them, found the version they thought was the most likely to be accurate, and made a canonical text that they thought was, as good as you could get. They never claimed it was without errors, by the way, despite what Christians will later make claims about. But they collected the best text they could find. And in this case, they're not trying to find out what's true. They're more trying to figure out which text is more reliable, right? So it's not about, did the Exodus really happen? It's about, is this letter a Vav or a Dalet? And so they make the most accurate copy that they think they can find, and we call that the Masoretic text. So when people get a Hebrew copy of the scriptures, they're almost always using the Masoretic text because that's this compilation compared to all these different versions that they created. And they also went through and they created vowels. So you see these little dots at the bottom and a couple of the dots at the top. Those are vowels. And those vowels tell you how to pronounce the words so that you can, and it removes that little piece of ambiguity that they were worried about. So they created a dot system to add the vowels back to the text. The other thing they added, which for some reason isn't in this copy of Hebrew I found, they added little squiggles over the top that tell you how to cantor it. And they're notes. They tell you how to sing the text. So if you've ever heard a Jewish person sing the Torah, where they cantor it and they Barashit, Bara, Shema, and I don't know, I'm not doing it right, so I don't want to slaughter that. But they have a way of singing it, and the notes are actually in other dots that they put over the top. So this is the Hebrew text that most of us use. But where did it come from? And is it accurate? So this is where, I've done a little literacy, and now we're diving a little bit into the scholarship, but this is kind of the etymology and the history and the genealogy of the Hebrew Bible as we have it. So we have this original Hebrew, and by that I just mean Isaiah wrote something, Hezekiah wrote something, somebody wrote something, whoever was the author, and they wrote it in Hebrew. And we have some original text, and the date of all those is different depending on which book. The Bible is not a single book, it's a collection of books. And for each one of these Old Testament books, there's different authorship, different dates, and sometimes multiple authorship within books. But there was some original text when it was written, and then it was copied, and then it was copied, and then it was copied. And then at some point, about 200 BC, it was copied again to get the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Masoretic text is here at the bottom, and it was a compilation that went from 590 AD to 500 AD, and then the latest text we have of it, the earliest text we have of the Masoretic text are from 1000 AD. So the Masoretic text is what we use. The Dead Sea Scrolls is much older, but that doesn't mean the Dead Sea Scrolls is right. It had a different genealogy, and so there are errors in the Dead Sea Scrolls where the Masoretic text is more likely correct, and there are errors in the Masoretic text where the Dead Sea Scrolls is more likely correct. And just because the Dead Sea Scrolls is older doesn't mean it's always right. So when you're trying to figure out what in the world the original text was, it's not trivial, because an error doesn't always favor the older text. The older text can be the one with the error. Then we have the Samaritan Pentateuch, which had a different genealogy. We have the Targum, which is an Aramaic translation of the whole thing. We have, at some point, an old Greek translation that was done in what's called the Septuagint, sometimes LXX, because that's the Roman numerals for 70. And according to tradition, 70 elders translated the Septuagint. And it was done in Egypt. So it's an Egyptian translation. It was a group of Hebrew religious believers in Egypt during the time of Alexandria, the city of Alexandria. And in Alexandria, they translated the Hebrew text into Greek. We call that the LXX, the Septuagint. Although I've split it out, the modern Septuagint is not the old Greek. The modern Septuagint was actually redacted, again by the Masoretes, to try to make it more accurate in the sense that they took the Masoretic text, and not anytime, but some of the times when the Septuagint differed, they changed the Septuagint to match the Masoretic text, which is unfortunate because what we want the Septuagint for is to tell us when the Masoretic text has a variant. And they've corrected, in air quotes, some of these variants. This leads to all sorts of Christian conspiracy theories where they claim that the Jews changed the Septuagint to take out references to Christ or to prophecies of Christ, that the Septuagint was redacted to make it less possible for Christians to use to defend Christianity. But some of the Old Greek is actually preserved in the New Testament. So when the New Testament quotes the Septuagint, it quotes not the modern Septuagint, but the Old Greek. So we can piece some of it together from the New Testament, which is always interesting, and thus leads to certain questions. When the New Testament quotes the Septuagint in a way that is more likely to refer to Jesus Christ or to make the prophecy look like it's more like Christ, are they quoting an original? Are they quoting a variant? Are they changing it themselves to make it more Christian? Or is that the original Septuagint? And even if it is the original Septuagint, is it more correct than the Masoretic text? You begin to see the problems. This is a maze of 1,000 passages. And then when the Dead Sea Scrolls show up, it gets even more exciting because sometimes the Dead Sea Scrolls agree with the Septuagint. Sometimes they agree with the Masoretic text. Sometimes they're different than both. So this is where it gets really fun. Of course, the King James authors used the Vulgate, which is a Latin translation made by the Roman Church, by St. Jerome, and they borrowed from the Masoretic Hebrew and the modern Septuagint to create their translation. So that's kind of where the King James came from, which was the archetypical English translation for so many years. They actually borrowed from what's the right word? Tyndale. Is it a Tyndale translation? Anyway, there was an English translation before them, and a lot of what they did is they just... Tyndale, thank you. They just copied that translation in most cases, and then they'd only differed if they thought there was a good reason to. And so that's the King James. Of course, the King James is not the translation I recommend we read anymore, but that's the one that's been the most influential. By the way, when we get to translation, I can't help it. I'm going to tell the joke now. There's this really great story, and I really ought to look this up, but there was a U.S. senator, and someone was talking about the Bible with him, and he said, if the King James was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. And I really hope he was joking, but I don't have enough confidence in religious people's in attempts to really be weird to not think he might have been serious. On my mission, I talked to all sorts of... I was LDS before I joined the Unitarian Universalists, and I went on a LDS mission where I would knock door to door and talk to people about religion. And I met people who believe some of the weirdest stuff you will ever... and by the way, what do you get when you mix a Mormon and a Unitarian? It's someone who knocks on your door to ask you what you believe. And that wasn't what I was doing, but I sure learned what a lot of people believe, and it was a fascinating experience. And, the percent of people who didn't know that Jesus, didn't read the King James and were fairly low. It was impressive how much of this history that you've just heard, so few people know. So this alone, kind of sets you in a category where you kind of have some feel for where these texts come from. I also want to point out that a lot of these variants are insignificant. So if you hear this discussion that I just had from a believer, they like to spend most of their time talking about how, yes, there are differences. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out individual details and words, but there's nothing here that's kind of theologically shattering. Well, yes and no. Most of the differences make absolutely no difference to the theology. There are one or two that kind of matter. So, for example, a virgin shall conceive, and you shall call his name Emmanuel, meaning God is with us. This is the famous passage in Matthew referring back to Isaiah's prophecy about Emmanuel. Unfortunately, in the Hebrew, it says a young woman shall conceive and shall call his name Emmanuel. And the reference to a virgin is in the Septuagint. And the Dead Sea Scrolls agrees in this case with the Masoretic text. So one of the core theological concepts of Christianity, the virgin birth, is tied up in this issue of translation. So it's not that they're completely unimportant, that none of these variants matter, but most of them are insignificant. That part is true. So this is by Emmanuel Tove, Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible. Textual criticism doesn't mean to criticize the text. It's the scholarly name for the people who spend their days trying to figure out whether this letter should be an R or a D by comparing all the different manuscripts and trying to figure out which one is right. That's kind of the idea. There's a book. His book is actually on the front desk up there. It's Emmanuel Tove's Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible, and he says, therefore, paradoxically, the Sopharim and the Masoretes carefully preserved a text that was already corrupted. So he's talking about this genealogy issue we've mentioned here. All right, so let me give you some examples. Saul was 1 year old when he began to reign. That makes no sense, by the way. And he reigned 2 years over Israel, but that's what the Masoretic text literally says. So the King James Version hacks it. Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, it's a hack. There's no evidence for that reading in the text, but they're trying to make sense out of something that's nonsensical. Then we get Saul was 30 years old when he began to reign from the Septuagint, and then other texts happen to say 21 or 50. It just depends on which of these manuscripts. No, by the way, the Septuagint itself, there's multiple manuscripts, so depending on which Septuagint manuscript you get, you've got that problem with the Septuagint too. And then the footnote says, and for the NRSV says, Saul was ... years old when he began to reign. Footnote 2 is not the entire number. Something has dropped out. We just don't know what. And unfortunately for my attempt to put this together, the Dead Sea Scrolls rendition of this verse isn't published, or wasn't when I put it together a few years ago, so it might be now. It'd be nice to go and look and see how it reads, but I actually don't know. Here's some other examples. Genesis 10:4 and 1 Chronicles 1:7 talk about the same person, this Dodanim, but in the Chronicles it's Rodanim. It's the same guy very clearly because they're mentioning the same genealogy. And by the way, the D and the R look awful similar in Hebrew. One is more curved than the other, and that's kind of the only difference. In modern Hebrew, they also look similar in kind of the more ancient version of the text. Either way, somebody miscopied something somewhere, and the question is which one is right. We have the same problem, Obal and Abimael and Ebal and Abimael in Genesis and 1 Chronicles. Okay, so now we've done kind of the history of the book, where it came from, how we got all these pieces, and I'm trying to look at the clock and figure out how much time I've got. Let's introduce the text, what it has. In modern English Bible Christian translations, the texts are put into a book order that is kind of based on the Septuagint. In the Hebrew, the book order, and it's roughly chronological, but not perfectly, which really confuses you, because if you read it from cover to cover, it jumps around. There's kind of a challenge. Everyone should read the Bible once, and so a lot of people will just decide they're going to read the Bible, and they start at the beginning and they try to read to the end. Don't do that. Don't do that. It's out of order. It's the chronological order isn't perfect, and you need some commentary anyway. But pick some order that's chronological. Read some sort of historical commentary with it, and otherwise, it just, most of it won't make sense to you. The Hebrew and Jewish editions of this that you'll get are in the Masoretic text order, and they also divide the text into three parts: the law, the prophets, and the writings. So in the New Testament, you often hear Jesus say, that which is written in the law and the prophets. He's referring to these parts. Now, what is the law? It's not that you go through the whole text and bring out every commandment. They've done that, but that is not what the law is. The law is a name for the first 5 books of Moses that also happen to contain the commandments Moses gave Israel, but they contain everything else. They contain the Genesis story of Adam and Eve, the flood, the Tower of Babel. All that is in what's called the first 5 books of Moses. That's the law: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then the prophets are things like Isaiah, Nehemiah, the prophets, Ezekiel. The writings are things like Psalms, which is their hymn book, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, this sort of thing. Those are the writings. So there's stuff, the first 5 books of Moses, then there's the prophets, and then the writings. So they will divide the text that way, which makes a little bit more sense, actually. And clearly, Jesus and the other people in the New Testament divided it that way because they talk about these divisions, and we don't know what they mean often when they refer to them. So here's the core biblical narrative. Genesis is a bit of an introduction. It's just the history of the people, because what they're trying to establish is their genealogy back to Adam and where Abraham came from and why we, the Hebrews, are a distinct people. The Exodus story, then, is where the story really begins, because it is about the formation of the nation of Israel as a distinct people as they are brought out of Egypt and become people. And then Numbers, Deuteronomy is more of what their wanderings in the wilderness. Leviticus is some laws. Numbers, Deuteronomy, their wanderings in the wilderness until they're brought to the promised land. Once they get to the promised land, they conquer the promised land, Joshua and Judges. And then their kings begin to reign, and 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles are 2 different schools. Kings and Samuel goes to one school, Chronicles goes to another. Those are 2 different parallel tellings of the history of Israel from the time of from the time of after the Judges and the conquest is over, from that time down to the destruction of Israel by the Babylonians. And that is a complete story from Genesis up to the destruction by the Babylonians. Later books, there are some were written later and were added after. So the Bible tells a coherent narrative from Genesis up to the Babylonian captivity. And then there's these other books kind of tacked on the end that happened after. And so it looks like whoever compiled this thing actually had in mind a coherent story. I'll show you what that was. You have a preamble, you have Moses, the conquest, the kingship, and the history of Israel. And this is that coherent story. They actually begin in Babylon. I mean, Genesis is Babylonian-centric too, but the story of their monotheism begins with Abraham. And he's in Babylon. And he's called from Babylon to a new land that he's promised will be his. You get the Exodus, the kingdom of Israel, the destruction of Israel, the Babylonian captivity, and then what happened after, and my arrow is pointing to the wrong thing. That should point from Babylon to Babylon. And so the idea is we started in Babylon. God gave us this nice, beautiful land. We sinned, and we ended up back in Babylon. That's how they internalized the events of the Babylonian captivity, and these texts were compiled at that time. So I said we have evidence of biblical texts from before the Babylonian captivity, right? I've mentioned the earliest ones we have, which is the one from Jeremiah's time, which is before the Babylonian captivity. They're compiling material from before, but they're putting it together in a cohesive story in Babylon. And they're telling the story of how they were called out of Babylon to be righteous. They were forged in Egypt. They captured their promised land. They lived there with their own king for years. And then because of their wickedness, they were taken back where they started in Babylon. And that's this coherent story. And then you have this kind of what happened after that gets tacked on the end of the story. These other prophets, like Malachi and Ezra. So, I like to do this. Stephen Prothero wrote a book called God is Not One, which if you want general religious literacy, I recommend Stephen Prothero. God is Not One. It'll tell you about Christianity, Judaism, Islam, the Yoruba, and he actually lists modern atheism. Now, it's not whether that should be a religion or not. He at least does this same analysis of their belief system. And he says these are the things everyone should be familiar with. You ought to know your way around these religions. They run the world. He also, I think Hinduism is one of the others. He's got 7 he goes through. That's a great book. I highly recommend it. But he also gave this way of thinking about religion that I think is comparative religion that is very, very useful. And that is, when dealing with another religious tradition or your own, ask the question, what is the problem? What is the solution? And how is the solution enacted? Because every religion kind of grows from this feeling that something is wrong with the world. And what is wrong? And then how do you overcome what is wrong? You can never boil anything down into a simple creed or statement. I mean, there's always complexity. But this is a really good, it clusters really well. It captures a lot of the core essence of each religious tradition, often, but not always. So if I were to do this with Christianity to give you an idea of how it works, what is the problem? Sin. What is the solution? Atonement through Jesus Christ. How is it obtained? Repentance, baptism, faith. And so you get an idea of what Christianity is about. If I do this with Islam, you have what is the problem? Pride. How does the solution? Submission. How is it obtained? The 5 pillars and the Hajj and the prayers and the... if I were to do it for Buddhism, it's even more fun. What is this problem? Suffering. What is because of our desires? And what is the solution? A relinquishment of our desires through the Noble Eightfold Path, meditation, retreat, etc. And that's how it's obtained. So you see how it kind of, it's not perfect, but it captures a lot of the core essence. And it also helps you realize something. These religious traditions that we like to say they're all the same, they don't even think the problem is the same the world is facing. And so there really are some fundamental differences in these religious traditions. They're not all the same. So if we were to do this with Israel, which is what we're going to try to do with the Old Testament. Now remember, the Old Testament authors are cobbling together many sources to tell a coherent story. So I'm asking, what is this pattern with that coherent story, not with the earlier texts and the pieces, right? What is the coherent story And the authors who are putting it together and compiling it, what do they think the problem is, the solution, and how is it obtained? Well, the problem is exile. You see, from Genesis itself, Adam is exiled because of his sin from the Garden of Eden and wants to come back. The temple complex itself is designed to represent the Garden of Eden and the return past the cherubim back into the presence of God in the garden. That's the atonement. That's also the Day of Atonement ritual. In fact, the word to repent means to turn around and go the other direction in Hebrew. Now, the Garden of Eden faced east. So when Adam was expelled, he headed east. The temple, it faces east. So when you go into the temple, you go west. So if you were to walk out of the temple, turn around, repent, and go back, you kind of follow Adam's journey out and back in. Exile is the key. Exile is also what's happening when the temple is destroyed in Jerusalem and they find themselves in exile in Babylon. So of course that was the core issue they were dealing with as exiles themselves. How is it obtained? Well, we need identity, we need gathering, and then we need a return. And so most of their prophecies and discussions are about forming identity as a nation in the midst of another nation. How do you as a group of exiles maintain your identity as Jews when you live in Babylon, when you live in America, when you live... So forging an identity as a separate people, gathering that people together and returning to the land of our inheritance and reforming the land that God has promised us is what's happening, and the story they seem to be telling. The loss of the land, the loss of the temple, the lamentation of that, and the desire to return, and then the story of their return when Cyrus sends them home and they get to rebuild the temple. Identity gathering and return. And how is it obtained? And not only that, but return to God, because that's the problem with the whole world, is we've been exiled and we need to come back. So you reunite with God and undo your exile from God and come back to God through covenant, mitzvot, which is their word for the commandments, and study of the Torah, the law. So you remember from Fiddler on the Roof, if I could study the Torah all day, that would be the sweetest thing. He wants to study the Bible because it's so much, right? Maybe you don't feel that. Maybe you do. Maybe you're here because you just wish you could study the Bible all day long. That would be the sweetest thing. All right. How are we going to read this thing? So let's assume that some of you at least are going to read this with me. How do you read it? First of all, what translation are you going to read it in? Because I'm going to assume most of you aren't going to go out and learn Hebrew and Greek. I'm just going to make that crazy assumption. Some of you might, but I'm going to assume that most of you aren't going to do that. So what are you going to do to read this thing? Well, first you need a translation, and which one? And this is where the alphabet soup comes in. You can have the KJV, the NKJV. I really should have added that. That's the New King James Version. The NIV, the Rhymes, the Amplified Bible, the NRSV, the NAB, the NASB, today's English version, the Living Bible. You even got the New World Translation. So what do? And there are many others. Now, the Living Bible is fun because it is an attempt to really be to remove all cultural references that we won't get and substitute them for a cultural reference we will get. So, for example, thy word is a flashlight to my feet. You got to love that. And the original, thy word is a lamp unto my feet. Flashlights didn't exist, but dang it, we're going to say flashlight so people understand. That's the Living Bible. Don't read that one, please. The other one we get is this New World Translation. That's the Jehovah's Witness translation. If they wander around and they pass out there, but that's the Bible they pass out. It's their own translation. That one's really hard to read. I mean, I don't know if you've ever tried, but they attempt to be so absolute literalistic in every passage that they don't smooth out any of the idioms, and it's almost impenetrable. It's just literal, word for word for word, and it's really hard to read. Don't read that one either. The King James, flowery, beautiful language. Everyone should read the King James a little bit just to get an idea. It's a beautiful book, wonderful, well written. Reminds you of reading Shakespeare. It's great. Everyone should read a few passages in the King James. It's also inaccurate. We didn't know the meaning of some. Not that they were bad translations. some of the words they didn't know the meaning of yet. Remember, Hebrew actually was a dead language. It was kind of a liturgical language for a long time. And then it was reinvented as modern Hebrew when the Jews came back to Jerusalem. But for years, it was a dead language. And as such, there's a lot of words we don't know what they mean. And we know more of what they mean now than they did then. And so, and this was before the Dead Sea Scrolls, etc. So the King James is probably the most inaccurate. Don't read that one either, although you should read a few passages because it's beautiful. But if you want to understand, that's probably not what you want to read. I recommend the NIV as a translation. I struggled with this, though, because the NIV was translated by evangelicals. It has a definite evangelical slant. The authors all believed the Bible was perfect and infallible. So it has that slant to it. But every translation you get has a slant. The NIV is a good mix between readability and literality. There's a few things they don't do literally enough that I think kind of obscures some of the meaning, but whatever. It's a good balance. It's reasonably well documented. Scholarship is decent. They did a good job of kind of the textual criticism and figuring out which passages are more likely to be right. And so the NIV is what I recommend. That's the New International Version. But you also have to figure out which edition to read, right? Because it's hard. You don't just buy an NIV. Then there's an NIV Study Bible, and there's an NIV Nevi'im, and there's about 4 different versions of the NIV, and I actually don't know what they all are. And then the King James, there's lots of those. There's the LDS version, obviously, which I grew up with. There's also the Cornerstone edition, which was done by the Freemasons. That one's fun. I have a copy of that just because I wanted all their footnotes. Their footnotes are fascinating because they're intentionally footnoting things they think are references to their rituals. That's fun. There's just the bare NIV, and then there's the Study Bible, etc. So let me give you an idea of what some of these are. This is the LDS one. I'm showing you this one because this is what I grew up with. You probably aren't going to read the NIV, the LDS King James, but this gives you an idea of what's out there. There's some chapter headings. So they got the chapter number. They got a heading that tells you what happens in this chapter. That's right under the heading. And then you have, you see 2 footnote, and it's marked in red, goes to Luke. And so there's cross references. We see there's also this this one here, the resurrection. Well, some of these are cut off, which is unfortunate. GR is Greek, so they've got an alternate translation of this word from the Greek. A topical guide, you can look up different topics, Israel, and then they even have a reference right here to Ether and the Doctrine and Covenants. Those are 2 Mormon scriptures. So they've cross-referenced all the way to their own books of scripture. So that's fun. This is the NIV Study Bible. This is the one I recommend. If you're going to get an edition of the NIV, try to find the Study Bible because it has, you notice at the top is the text. There are headings when different subjects, because the chapters actually don't break in the middle of subjects, unfortunately. Whoever did the chapter breaks didn't understand the subjects. And so they've got little bold things when subjects change. They've got footnotes down the middle. Those are cross-references. So when one prophet will quote another prophet, that'll be in those cross-references. So if you're reading the Old Testament and there's a passage that Jesus also quotes, they'll be in the middle cross-reference. And then at the bottom is cultural help. So it'll say, when he talks about Tyre, this is what the city of Tyre is. Very useful stuff. So the cultural cross-reference is the most useful thing you'll get out of that. At the beginning of each book, they also have an essay on when it was written, who wrote it, they think. It's a conservative estimate, so they'll think Paul wrote a lot more than most scholars think he wrote. But who wrote it traditionally, when it was written, and then they have an outline of the text. I love the outline because it's like, this is what is in here. This is what's in this book. And you can see the structure of the whole book. And they have those introductions to every single book, those cultural cross-references at the bottom, and then the cross-references to quotations and things and similar ideas in the middle. I love this edition. So if you're going to read a copy of the Bible, find yourself an NIV is my recommendation, and find yourself the study version of it. Don't buy the regular version. Buy a study version of the NIV. Some of these books I'm actually going to hope that I can recommend that we get for the sanctuary. Okay, so I am out of time, and I'm going to quit here And when we come back, we will begin this discussion of the names of God and how they're used in the Bible. And we will cover Genesis 1 and talk about the creation and the different accounts of the creation, who wrote them. We'll talk about authorship, E and J and the documentary hypothesis, and we'll cover the creation. Yes? So May 20th, the next class is at May 20th. I actually didn't know until I was just told too, so I'm glad you looked that up. May 20th, 9:30, we'll go dive into Genesis 1 and 2. So if you wanted to read ahead, Genesis 1 and 2. And the books I recommend, I'm hoping to get them added, some of them at least, bought for our library so that you don't have to have your own copy of some of this stuff. There's also a bunch of commentaries, books up front. I was going to go through all those, but I'm out of time. We'll maybe do that next time. But there's also some stuff that might be useful for understanding the Bible up front. All right. I'll see you next month.